Dr. Siobhan O'Sullivan does like knowing animals. Dr. Siobhan O'Sullivan does like knowing animals.
Hey people, welcome to Knowing Animals. Knowing Animals is a podcast where we speak to animal studies scholars about a piece of their work. I'm Siobhan O'Sullivan and I do like knowing animals. This episode of Knowing Animals is brought to you by ASA. ASA is the Australasian Animal Studies Association. I'm a member of ASA. I've been a member every year for about the past, 8 years, I'd say, probably since it was first organised, first initiated at a conference at the University of Newcastle in Australia. I really enjoy being part of ASA. I get to engage with wonderful scholars. I get to learn all about opportunities, funding opportunities, calls for papers, conferences, etc. So I'm really happy and proud to be a member of ASA, and I encourage you to also think about joining ASA. ASA is the Australasian Animal Studies Association, but you can be a member from anywhere in the world. It's just $50 Australian for waged people, even less for the unwaged. So think about joining ASA, the Australasian Animal Studies Association. Well, this is a really, really momentous week for us here at Knowing Animals because I'm joined by the very, very first guest I ever had on the program, which is Dr. Dinesh Wadiwel. Now, hopefully the sound quality and perhaps even my ability to ask questions has improved in the 120 odd episodes that I've done since interviewing Dinesh in the first place. But Dinesh, for those of you who don't know, is Senior Lecturer in Human Rights and Socio-Legal Studies at the University of Sydney. And today we're going to discuss his book, The War Against Animals, which was published by Brill in 2015. Welcome to the public podcast, Dinesh.
It's such an honour to be back on the show, Siobhan, and especially I remember our first interview and we were struggling with the technology.
Yes.
So it's lovely to see the new technology
yes.
and to see the show progress so far. It's a real testament to your efforts.
Well, thank you. Yes, I'm on my fourth bit of equipment now, and I think perhaps I've finally found something that works properly. I've not really learned how to speak much better since then, but perhaps my question asking has improved. So, Dinesh, as you know, the first question's always the same. Why this piece of work? What led you to write this?
The War Against Animals was published in 2015, and it was a book that took actually about 10 years to write. It took a long time. And how I got there was quite unplanned. So I did a PhD in political theory, which I submitted in 2005. And largely during that thesis, I was really interested in how states use violence today. I did a lot of case study work in that. And torture was one of the things that I looked at closely, the practice of torture and how it evolved in the 20th century. In the midst of writing that book, or that thesis, I became really interested in how did this all apply to thinking about animals. It's not something I initially started thinking about because largely I was looking at how violence was used by states against humans. But suddenly I became interested in, well, could we say the same things about animals? At the time, I was struck by the way that animal studies was forming as a discipline and how closely the roots of animal studies were tied to discussions around animal ethics in philosophy. As far as I could see, many of these discussions were largely individual in nature. So often philosophers would focus on the ethical decisions made by individuals around animals or the ethics of using animals by humans. And often the solutions proposed were individual in nature. So primarily often individuals making personal choices around changing their diet. But I think this struck me as rather strange because when I looked at the work that was done in politics or sociology that examined mass-scale violence, typically you would focus not only on individuals and individual actions, but the role of institutions, practices, states, cultures in making that violence happen on a mass scale. So in the midst of that, I became really interested in how do we look at the problem of how we use animals from that basis as a kind of structural political analysis. So that was the first impulse. The second was that I was really lost for words to describe what we humans do to animals. And what the singular fact that stuck in my mind was that most of the ways, as far as I could see, most of the ways that humans use animals largely involve forms of violence and domination. In fact, most of the ways, the mainstay ways that we use animals, involve making animals suffer or making them die for our pleasure. And this struck me as an extraordinary political relationship. A number of commentators in different guises have commented that our relationship with animals looks like a kind of war. So lots of activists will say we're at war against animals. But various scholars, ranging from Jonathan Foer to Jacques Derrida, have described our relationships with animals as being about war. So the book starts out trying to provide an explanation for how maybe our mainstay political relationship with animals is about a concerted form of hostility or violence that structurally we might describe as a kind of war.
Fabulous. Yeah, Dinesh, your book, I think, to my mind, has been one of the real kind of game changers in thinking about animals, particularly politically. And, I can remember when it came out and, prior to its publication, I would never have thought about our relationship with non-human animals as violent. But now I hear myself using that vocabulary. So I think it's a really important book. Can you tell us a little bit about the way in which you think about animal bodies being used against them? Because that's one of the themes you draw out, is that the actual animals are used against them as part of this violent structure. Can you say something about that?
Sure. So lots of the book is an interrogation of how the rationality of the violence that we expose animals to. And I noticed that actually it's quite multifaceted, the forms of violence. So we can often think almost immediately lots of individual forms of violence. So say somebody hurting or killing an animal might be an intersubjective form of violence. But there's lots of violence that I would describe as related to institutional mass-scale practices. And these are the kinds of violence that are typically practiced in animal agriculture. They're large-scale practices, so they happen routinely, millions and millions of times, almost per day globally. And they're quite mundane, and I don't mean mundane in the sense that I don't think that they matter. They are treated systematically as almost banal. They just happen so frequently and often understood almost as not violent. So part of the book is about describing this relationship. One thing I noticed was how insidious the forms of violence we use against animals are, and the ways that particular technologies almost use the resistance of animals against themselves. In the opening sections of the book, I describe the processes that are used in chicken processing, and particularly the moments that lead up to the death of animals in mass-scale processing. So people may know that one of the things that happens towards the end of a chicken's life in industrialized slaughter is that workers will grab chickens and stuff them into crates, take them to a processing facility, and then hang them upside down on a conveyor belt, and those unfortunate animals are led to their death there. The curious things about the technologies that are used are that they, in a way, seek to use the animal's body against themselves. So the animals are hung upside down, and the hanger itself is designed in such a way that the chicken's feet is caught, and the animal and their own body weight, in a way, becomes the thing that constrains them in the process and leads them to the slaughter. This really reminded me of lots of contemporary torture techniques that are used against humans. So one of the unfortunate aspects of the development of torture in the 20th century is that we use now techniques such as forced standing positions in interrogation, where people, for example, are asked to stand for long periods of time with their hands above their head, which we can all try at home, and unfortunately it's very painful after, say, 20 or 30 minutes. or asked to crouch for long periods of time. In all of these cases, commentators on torture will describe the way that the body of the person is used as a weapon against themselves. I see these sorts of practices all over the place in animal agriculture, and they're quite disturbing. Again, I think there's an interesting connection between the rationalities of violence that we find in the human sphere and those we find in the animal sphere as well.
The concept of resistance is really important to you when you think about these issues and when you write about animals. And I've heard you say many times that, we should be mindful that animals do resist. They're not willing participants in this. Why is the concept of resistance so important to you, or why does that contribute something to your thinking?
I think resistance, I find it a very useful thing to think about as a political theorist. And I think the reason I think it's useful is that it avoids entering particular kinds of debates that have, I would say, shaped both animal ethics but also the emerging political turn in animal studies. Lots of the field is concerned with the capacities of animals to either to think or engage, but also to deliberate. So lots of recent political turn studies have really focused on, can animals deliberate like humans in political discourse, and can we therefore include them in democratic processes in some way? My interest in resistance is that it is a way of articulating the agency of animals without having to get into their individual capacities, because a whole range of animals quite demonstrably resist and therefore exercise a kind of political agency against us. The second reason I think resistance is important is that it always tells us about violence. So resistance accompanies violence, and it reminds us that animals are not willing participants in the processes we thrust them into. And we see this quite directly in the technologies that are used to capture and force animals to participate in our production systems. So I described before, just a bit earlier, the hangers that are used in processing lines to take animals to their death, or chickens to their death. Typically, these technologies are designed precisely to nullify the resistance of animals. We wouldn't need a hanger to hang chickens upside down on a processing line if those animals willingly wanted to go slaughter. I notice these instruments of violence everywhere. So I'm particularly interested in wild capture fishing. And if you think about it, the most basic instruments to capture fish, such as the fish hook or the net, basically tell us that those fish do not want to be caught. We wouldn't have a fish hook or a fish net if those animals wanted to be caught. It is because they don't want to be caught. They actively resist or evade our capture that we design these instruments to capture them.
So, Dinesh, you've also done a lot to remind me and remind others that a great deal of violence is perpetrated against animals who live in the sea. Why are animals that live in the sea a particular interest of yours? What is about that really wants to what calls your attention?
There's a few reasons. I mean, the first reason I think is that I don't think it's unfair to say that animal studies has by and large neglected sea animals. Most of the high-profile texts in animal studies or animal ethics have largely focused on land animals and haven't necessarily taken seriously either the ethical or political situation that shapes what happens to sea animals. This materializes as well in animal advocacy. So when I look around at high-profile animal advocacy campaigns, they typically fail to focus on fish. And I find this quite surprising. Numerically, we use fish more than any other animal. So at the moment, the estimates range from 1 trillion to 3 trillion fish that are used annually by humans. This scale is completely huge if we compare it to land animals. I think the most recent estimate is that we use maybe it was last year, 75 billion land animals. So to use between 1 and 3 trillion fish. This is monstrous. As far as I can see, animal advocacy organisations have not really problematized this. Connected to this is that where there's been a lot of development in improving welfare for land animals, and this has led to, I think, material changes in how animals are used, but also, I think, to their benefit, has at least minimised or reduced the suffering that those animals have experienced. We find that there are almost no welfare protections provided to fish. So, certainly as far as wild capture fishing goes, there are little or no welfare precautions that are applied to those animals. And those animals, as far as recent science tells us, experience pain, have emotions, have cognition that is comparable to land animals. So this, to me, is completely horrifying that we have this situation. There are also some massive changes happening globally that I think we need to keep up with that relate to fish. It's not only that fish have expanded in scale globally, it's that diets globally are changing. So we've noticed that in global north countries, many people had transitioned from traditional so-called red meats to white meats. So people are increasingly eating chicken, but also increasingly eating fish. So global human consumption has been driven by this, but also it's concerning for me that the worst welfare applies to the animals we eat the most globally. Attached to this, the production of animals, of sea animals, has changed in quite a fundamental way. And it's happened, I think, under our watch, with very little comment from animal advocates. I'm speaking in particular about the growth of fish farms or aquaculture. 2 years ago, the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization announced that more than 50% of human consumption of fish had been derived from fish farms. This is quite a staggering shift in global production. Basically, aquaculture has risen to this level, supplying 50% of human food in the space of 4 decades. In other words, it's just taken us 4 decades to domesticate fish when it took millennia to domesticate land animals. So from my perspective, this is really, it's fascinating, but also really sobering. And my strong view is that this is the next phase where animal advocates have to move towards, is looking at these animals, the situation they face, the poor welfare that they face, but also the horrific life they face in dense sea pens, which rivals the horrors of factory farms that face land animals as we speak today.
Well, Dinesh, in your book, you do talk about a truce, a possible truce. Can you tell us something about what your vision is, how you use that concept and what it might mean, say, for animal advocates?
Sure. We're all experimenting with different ways to respond to the situation we find before us. And I think for animal advocates, the situation, I think it's fair to say, feels overwhelming. I was really interested in the idea of truce because from my perspective, it's very difficult to imagine how we constructively move forward unless we stop applying violence towards animals. And one way to think about this is, if we're in a situation of violence and hostility, it's very hard to meaningfully talk about how to move forward with the party who's exposing us to violence unless they stop being violent towards us. So to me, this is a really obvious thing that we need to, it gives us a political program. So a political program, of course, is firstly, we need to encourage humans to stop exercising this systematic violence towards animals. But then we need to, once we're in this space of peace, start to move forward, right? So that's my interest in Truce. But I was also interested in the book in whether it is possible to imagine temporary spaces where we stop violence from happening. I think to an extent, some animal advocates are already doing this in different forms. You know, Siobhan, that there's a lot of interest in the sanctuary movement, and maybe sanctuaries might describe a kind of space of truce. But I was also interested in the way that truce might be a useful way to think about political action. One of the places I'm particularly interested in is whether animal advocates can collaborate or work with union movements representing workers who work in slaughterhouses and industrialised animal agriculture. As we know, globally, this workforce is highly exploited and typically face poor conditions of work and typically, of course, face poor unionisation of their work. So a number of unions globally are working to try and unionise this workforce to demand better conditions. From my perspective, there's a useful alliance that beckons there in finding a way for workers to collaborate with animal advocates. Naturally, we're not going to agree on everything. Workers who work in animal agriculture want to keep their jobs and need to keep killing animals or be involved in supporting that industry in order to survive. Animal advocates want to stop those industries. So on the face of it, feels like we have limited to speak about. That said, I think there are some gains to be made by these two parties working together. Animal advocates and unions share an agreement that industrial animal agriculture moves too quickly. So if we slow down production lines, this reduces the number of animals that are used, and this actually benefits both workers and animal advocates. Working together, of course, creates opportunities for space and potentially truce. So in the book, I speak about the role of strike action as a way to close slaughterhouses and temporarily stop the action of animal death. I reckon there's something interesting in the idea of animal advocates working with unions to stop the slaughterhouse, even if it is just for one day. This creates a material way to reduce the number of animals that are used. It creates an opportunity for solidarity between workers and animal advocates where we can actually work with people and build agreement about what a better world might look like. And potentially it moves us closer towards the goal of, I think, hopefully closing the slaughterhouse one day.
Wonderful. Well, Dinesh, as you know, I ask everyone who comes on Knowing Animals to answer quick questions. Because you're a return guest, you're going to be answering 4 quick questions. Are you ready for your 4 quick questions?
I think so.
What's been the most satisfying or rewarding aspect of being an animal studies scholar?
I think the lovely thing about being an animal studies scholar is working on something that you're passionate about. I see a lot of academic colleagues who reach this point in their career. I mean, I'm a mid-career researcher, I guess, using the jargon of the university. I notice a lot of colleagues who it seems like they're maybe a little bit lost or their passion has dried up. The passion that drew them to academia has dried up. But I don't see the same thing amongst my animal studies colleagues. And like them, I feel very passionate about the work I'm doing. It feels like it's working towards a set of goals that I am fundamentally committed towards. And finally, I'd say that I just love working with other animal studies academics. We all have very different points of view, but what brings us together is a certain passion. And it's lovely to feed off that passion and be able to engage with people who share some of the same vision. To me, it's a rare joy in academia to be able to do this.
Maybe now's a good time to have a mini ad. I know it's most unusual to pause in the middle of 4 quick questions, but if there are people listening to this episode who live in Sydney or in Sydney from time to time, and you'd like to observe or even participate in Dinesh and I arguing about points of view, and also perhaps would like to see John Hadley in the mix, Dinesh, John Hadley and I run a monthly reading group, Animal Studies in Sydney, or ARIS, and so we're very, very keen to have people come along. If you're in Sydney and you'd like to be part of the conversation, please check us out on Facebook or get in contact. Okay, commercial over. Dinesh, what's been the most challenging or disheartening aspect of being an animal studies scholar?
I think the really difficult thing about being an animal studies scholar is the marginalisation the discipline and our ideas face, both within academia and in the wider community. It's no secret to animal studies scholars that some of the ideas that are contested in animal studies are treated with a sense of disdain by many other academics, and often our field feels a bit belittled. The flip side is I think that marginalisation helps to give us a sense of solidarity about what we're doing. And maybe just to plug that group again, Animal Rights in Sydney, I think the great thing about these sorts of groups is the amount of passion that comes into the room whenever we meet. Usually we end up having a really fascinating conversation with people from different perspectives, but all sharing this strong desire to make a difference for animals. And to me, it's one of the rarest spaces in academia.
And irrespective of the intensity with which we argue our point, we all manage to go off to the pub afterwards and share a beer in good spirits.
Which is always the best part of the night.
That's right. So, Dinesh, can you think of an animal studies scholar who you'd like to give a shout out to? This is your opportunity to give a nod to someone who perhaps is an emerging scholar or someone who you think hasn't received the recognition they deserve, or perhaps they're writing in a language other than English.
This was a very hard question to answer because there's so many people doing lots of fantastic work. I think Australia has amazing animal studies scene like internationally, and it's something that when I travel, people constantly comment about the situation in Australia and the remarkable scholars that we produce. And I think probably it's a result of that wonderful community we have here. There are lots of postgraduates doing work. I feel like it would be unfair to single out any of them, but we have a number of postgraduate research students in Australia at different universities all doing amazing work at the moment. And I think of this in a generational way, that they are a product of a generation of really wonderful animal studies scholars. I did want to say one particular scholar, when I thought about it, there's one particular scholar that's been very influential for me, although he's not prominent in animal studies and certainly not prominent in English-speaking animal studies. He largely writes in German. My German is terrible, but I can make out a little bit. His name is Fahim Amir. I think he's based in Italy at the moment, but maybe it's Austria. He's recently released a book called Schwein und Zeit, which is with pigs and time, which is a play on Heidegger's book, Being and Time. But it's a book about animal resistance. And he's consistently worked in the space of critical theory, animals, and art theory. And some of his work, there are a few of his essays that are translated into English. I encourage people to have a look at them. They're just fascinating. And fascinating in the sense that he emphasizes that at the end of the day, we cannot treat animals as simply passive victims of the violence we expose them to. They actively resist, and we need to recognize this resistance.
Wonderful. Well, that's another name to add to the list. Dinesh, are you optimistic about the future of human, non-human animal relationships?
Yes and no. So I think I am optimistic, and at least the proof of this is that I wouldn't keep working in this area if I wasn't. So I am optimistic that change can happen and we can contribute to that change. I also share some optimism with other advocates, noticing some of the things that have changed, sometimes actually quite dramatically over the last few years. So lots of commentators have pointed out that certainly in the global north, there's been a lot of interest in, say, vegan diets, and maybe recognition of climate change and the need for us to change the way we behave to both animals and nature is slowly changing attitudes. So maybe this is true. That said, when I look at the data, I'm less optimistic. So when I look at the reality of the way that the globe is restructuring animal production, I'm less optimistic and aware of the amount of work that needs to be done. Just to give you one example, maybe two examples. I mentioned aquaculture. I'm foreseeing a future where we will see wild fish capture decline, but a massive aquaculture industry take its place. So from my perspective, there's a lot of work to face a future where fish on a large scale will become, I think, a central part of human diets globally. The second thing that I think we need to pay attention to is the global dynamics of animal production and where that production is going to happen. Just like with the manufacture of other goods, and I'm using the language, of course, of the economists involved in animal agriculture, we're seeing a globalization of animal production that is shaping where animals are and how they are used. As we speak, China is building the world's largest dairy farm. It will have 100,000 cows in it, and there's never been a dairy farm this size. I believe if I'm not mistaken, the size of the farm is roughly equivalent to the size of Portugal. This, to me, tells us something about the future of animal production. And just like we have seen with the manufacture of cars or textiles or electronics, animal production will move to the places where the efficiencies are the greatest, and we're likely to see the same textural change in how production of animals happens.
So we can't just see the emergence of vegan magnums and rest with that. That's not the full picture, right?
Vegan magnums are wonderful, and I would love it if this was a sign of an optimistic future. My worry is that by focusing just on the consumption items that are available in the global north, and particularly to middle-class consumers, we miss the reality of what is happening globally for animals.
Sobering. Well, Dinesh, what are you working on next?
Relevant to that whole discussion of production, I'm currently finishing a book on animals and capitalism. I see this as a part 2 to the war against animals. And in the midst of writing The War Against Animals, I became very interested in how does capitalism relate to the kind of violence that I was systematically describing in that book. I'm particularly interested in this book in interrogating a particular philosopher, Karl Marx, who I think is often misunderstood certainly by animal advocates, and I think actually gives us a lot of material for thinking about both the violence that we expose animals to, but also how animals relate to our most prominent form of economic exchange, i.e. capitalism.
If Marx was alive today, would you be able to persuade him to become vegan?
I very much doubt it. Marx was avowedly anthropocentric.
Right.
That said, I think Marx did pay a lot of attention to animals in production. And one of the fascinating things about reading Marx's Capital is that he was writing at a time when the distribution of raw materials such as cotton, but also hides and meat were the primary exchange commodities. So there's a lot of material in Capital that is about animals. And he was very aware, I think, of the potential for intensification of animal production. And certainly if we read Capital Volume 2, there are sections of that where I think he foresees the factory farm. So these are quite remarkable sections, but I don't think Marx is an animal advocate at all.
Interesting. How can people find out more about your work?
Well, I'm an academic at the University of Sydney, so I have a website, and all my publications are there, so you're welcome to have a look at that. I do try and write blog pieces that are hopefully a bit more accessible. So if you look at the Sydney Environment Institute, that has some of my blogs, but there's also a great new journal which I'd like to give a plug to, which is called Animal Liberation Currents, that's come out of Canada. And maybe once a year I write a long essay for that journal. Finally, there's a few videos of me that have crept onto YouTube. I can't look at them myself, but if you'd like to have a look at me giving lectures or talks on YouTube, just Google me or look me up on YouTube.
I'll check it out, Dinesh. I can't wait.
Thank you.
Well, Dinesh, thank you so much for joining us for Knowing Animals. And thank you to the listeners for joining us for Knowing Animals, a podcast where we speak to animal studies scholars about their work. Now, you can find out more about us by following us on Twitter at knowing_animals or following us on Facebook at Knowing Animals. We also have an Instagram feed. But more than anything, if you can spare a few minutes to leave us a review on iTunes, the reviews make it easier for other people to find us and then to learn all about the lives of animals. I'm Siobhan O'Sullivan, and I do like knowing animals.